Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Actually, that was not me talking just a second ago. That was Ted Williams, our Media Center guru, and I'd like to thank him for helping us put this together today. Hi, Kathy. Good morning. So, my name is Jonathan Kressig. I'm the Director of Youth Services, and today we're going to talk about pre-employment transition services and order of selection and how those two things sort of interact when they do interact. Hopefully, many of you are back from our sort of truncated webinar back in September when we were having some audio difficulties. And I'm hopeful that you can all actually hear me today, so that's great. Let's see, since we're doing this from the Media Center at the Government Center, the Indiana Government Center, you actually won't be hearing from our hosts, but I do want to give a shout out to InSource and especially Kathy Boswell for helping to put all this together. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I think Kathy was probably a little concerned that we had some housekeeping things. I think she sent those out to you earlier, but just as a reminder, there will be a survey sent out after the webinar is completed. The other thing is that there is no call-in number for this particular webinar. You do need speakers on your laptop or whatever other device that you are using. Although we do have closed captioning for your convenience, so hopefully that will help too. Let's see, and a recording will be available later. Trying to see if there's anything else. Oh, I know. We do have some new handouts. I sent Kathy a couple of handouts back in October, and things changed so rapidly here that I sent her some new ones like on Friday, and I think she sent those out to you yesterday. If you're worried that you don't have the latest, just look at the date, whatever the latest date is. Those are the ones that you need. So it'll be late November, early December, and we'll go over those too in a second here as part of the webinar. So welcome back, and let's go ahead and get started. Let me see if I can make this work. Okay, good. Some of you have probably heard this information before, but I don't want to make that assumption. And I do want to make sure that everyone has kind of a good base of knowledge about pre-ETS and order of selection. So where did pre-ETS or pre-employment transition services come from? That was made into law basically through WIOA, or the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and that was signed in July of 2014 by President Obama. Replaced the Workforce Investment Act of 1998. There was one other housekeeping thing. I knew I would forget this. As I'm talking and as I'm doing this presentation, if you do have any questions, please just go ahead and put those in the chat box. I will try to keep an eye on those as I go through the presentation, but if you're worried that I missed it, do not hesitate to go ahead and type it in again. If there are any I've missed, I'm sure I can get to those later and email you some answers or call you. So put any questions you've got in the chat box as we move along, and I'll try to get those as they come up. So anyway, so WIOA replaced the Workforce Investment Act of 1998, and the emphasis was on competitive integrated employment. And due to WIOA, VR is required to provide pre-ETS or pre-employment transition services to students with disabilities. So what does that mean exactly? Oh, one other thing with this, you may ask yourself, if this was signed into law July of 2014, it was just a year ago that we actually started pre-ETS in the great state of Indiana. The reason for that is, even though it was signed into law, there were actually no federal regulations at that point. We had to wait until, I think, September of last year to actually get the final regulations. And some things had actually changed from the initial regulations that were put out. So kind of a good thing we didn't start right away, although it does leave us a little bit behind the eight ball, but we are catching up rapidly, as you will soon see. So WIOA and pre-ETS. Pre-employment transition services has 5 focus areas, and I'll mention that here in the next slide. And this is for eligible and potentially eligible students with disabilities. This really greatly expands the scope of what VR is able to do and the individuals that we are required to work with. We're required to set aside 15% of our federal VR program funds. So we get approximately 80% of our funds through the federal government and about 20% obviously through the state government. It's not exactly that, but it's pretty close to that. And now we're required to set aside 15% of that allotment to provide pre-ETS to students with disabilities. What that means is approximately $9 to $10 million every year. So potentially eligible, what is that? What does that mean, and how does that expand what VR does and who we work with? It's defined as a student with a disability who has either not applied, so not applied for VR, or has applied and not yet been determined eligible for voc rehab, who receives special ed services basically through a Section 504 plan or through an IEP. Or it could be any other student with a disability, as long as we have some type of disability documentation. So potentially eligible means a student who has applied, and actually it could be, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll get to that in a second. So maybe not applied or has applied and not yet been determined eligible. Sorry, I know this stuff so well, I sometimes get ahead of myself, so you have to bear with me. So let's look at the pre-ETS requirements and what those 5 things are. These are required to be at least available to students with disabilities statewide. And there's 5 of those: job exploration counseling, work-based learning experiences, counseling on opportunities for enrollment in post-secondary education, workplace readiness, and instruction and self-advocacy. So what that means is there's some examples here of what each of those things mean. So job exploration counseling, they're really just what they sound like. That could be interest inventories, reviewing career websites, high school-based courses on career choices. Work-based learning could be paid or non-paid. It could be job shadowing, so visiting some different job sites. It could be long-term internships, on-the-job training, apprenticeships, that kind of thing. Counseling on opportunities for post-secondary. It could be looking at the wide range of career pathways, agriculture, manufacturing, looking at opportunities including community colleges, universities, trade technical schools, how to fill out a FAFSA form, that kind of thing. Workplace readiness, again, that is exactly what it sounds like: a lot of soft skills training, employability skills training, social interpersonal skills. And instruction and self-advocacy could be instruction and self-awareness, disability disclosure, when to do that, how to go about doing that, requesting accommodations, basically advocating for yourself. Okay, so we have a question from Dawn. Might sound stupid, I doubt it, but is VR same as vocational rehabilitation, aka voc rehab? Yes, those 3 things are exactly the same, and that's my bad. I get so used to using our acronyms that I assume everybody knows that. But yes, VR, vocational rehabilitation, and voc rehab, same thing. And thank you for asking, because that sounds like the kind of question I would ask during one of these trainings, so no problem. So those are the 5 basic pre-ETS requirements. Any questions so far about any of that? I'll pause here for a second to see. Okay, so students and youth with disabilities. So what is the difference? And WIOA does define these differently. Students with disabilities, what that means is for Indiana, an individual with a disability in secondary education who is from age 14 to 22, yes, any age requirement, 14 to 22. And federal law defines this slightly differently, but defers to the state if it's more inclusive. So Indiana's definition of a student with disability was more inclusive than federal law. So that's why we go with age 14 to 22. And it's an individual with a disability in secondary education. I should actually expand that a little bit. This was originally in the original regulations surrounding WIOA and pre-employment transition services, but they have since expanded that to an individual with a disability in secondary or even post-secondary education, as long as they are still from age 14 to 22. So we are even allowed to provide pre-ETS to individuals who are in post-secondary setting. At this point, our focus is really on high school students, because we need to get this statewide and make sure it's available to those students. And then down the road, I think we'll probably look at offering this to post-secondary ed students. So that's students with disability. A youth with a disability is an individual with a disability, age 14 to 24, who may or may not be attending a secondary educational institution, or for that matter, post-secondary educational. So to confuse matters even more, a student with a disability is always a youth with a disability, but not every youth is a student. Does that make sense? The distinction is important for pre-ETS because only students with disabilities are eligible. So if you are an individual who is not in an educational setting, either secondary or post-secondary setting, you would not be eligible for pre-ETS. You have to be a student with a disability in secondary or post-secondary, age 14 to 22. So that's why that's important, and that's an important distinction. Okay, let's see. So pre-eds contracts. So what we did is we received 22 proposals last summer for the provision of pre-ed services, and we funded 9 of those proposals for a total of about $7 million over 2 years. So these were the 9 agencies that we awarded pre-eds funding to for the next couple of years. The reason that we went with these 9, basically this was only available to our CRPs or community rehabilitation providers. And the reason for that is we felt like we really had to hit the ground running. So we went with providers who we felt already had a great presence in their community, already had some good connections with local school systems, and already had contracts with vocational rehabilitation. So that made things a little bit easier for us to kind of get started and hit the ground running with that. So these are the 9 agencies or community rehab providers that we awarded contracts to for 2 years for provision of pre-eds. Now, these 9 providers are at this point hitting about 70 counties. When they started, it was, I can't even remember, but it was a lot fewer than 70 counties. And that's why I had Kathy send out some updated information, because at the end of October, we had not yet hit 70 counties. So they're slowly but surely kind of expanding their reach. And each provider is collaborating with other providers for the provision of pre-ed services or pre-employment transition services. So obviously, these 9 providers could not possibly hit 70 counties on their own. So each one of those providers could be considered kind of the fiscal agent. They do all of kind of the major fiscal work, and then it sort of trickles down to these other providers who they are working with to hit these 70 counties. Not all school systems in those 70 counties are receiving pre-eds at this point. Unfortunately, we're working on that, but we're not there yet. Again, as I said, students can be eligible or potentially eligible for VR services. So I explained what potentially eligible means. So it's an individual, a student with a disability who has either applied for VR and not yet been found eligible, or hasn't even applied for VR. But students who are already eligible for VR, so they're already in the VR system and receiving services, can also receive pre-eds. So you can receive both. If you are a student with a disability and you kind of fit the bill, you're 14 to 22, you have an IEP, a 504 plan, or some other documented disability, even if you're already receiving VR services, you can also receive pre-eds if it makes sense for you to do that. And these can be provided in individual or group settings. So Dawn has a question. Have not heard of any of these. In my area, Tippecanoe, Wabash Center, maybe. I am glad you asked, Dawn, because hopefully you guys have those new handouts that I had Kathy send out recently, or even the earlier ones that she sent out back in October or early November. That kind of explains where these services are available at this point. And I'll explain how we're expanding that in a second. So if you have those in front of you, hopefully you do, if you want to pull those out, the one that says it's 2-sided and it says pre-employment transition services on the front of it, the idea behind this was to kind of give people a basic notion of what pre-eds is and what it means. So yeah, Kathy says updated information was sent this morning. So when you get that updated information, or even if you have the old information, take a look at that. The 2-sided page that says pre-employment transition services on the front page is basically explains what pre-eds is, a lot of what I just said. But the back page shows our 9 providers, and it shows what counties they are working in, and it gives a contact name or email for that county, for that provider and those counties. So if you're interested in knowing if pre-eds is available in your county at this point, that's the form to look at. There's another form that gives a little bit more detailed information, and it has providers, counties, schools listed. So it lists who the provider is, who they're collaborating with. The counties, again, are listed, and then it lists also the school systems that they're working with within those counties. So, Dawn, if you want to take a look at both of those forms, that should tell you who is and what counties are covered and which are not. Honestly, I don't think Tippecanoe is yet, and I know that might sound funny that I'm okay. Easter Seals Crossroads. The reason I hesitated a little is because it is changing so rapidly, and we have providers offering to take on new counties. And Easter Seals Crossroads here in central Indiana has agreed recently to take on Tippecanoe County. What that means is they may not yet be in those school systems, but they intend to get into those school systems soon. So yes, that has just recently been added, so you may not yet be aware of it. But if you want to look at both of those forms, hopefully that'll help explain where it's available, who is providing those services, and what school systems within those areas are being served. So hopefully that will help. I think they're really a good couple of forms for you. Any questions about any of that? Okay, I see Kathleen Lind is typing, so I thought I'd give her a second before I moved on to the next slide. No pressure, Kathleen. Oh, Kathy, what if my county is covered but not my school system? If that's the case, let me know. And what I'm doing in those instances is I'm letting the providers know, hey, we have some interest from this school system. And depending upon the provider and their capacity, they may or may not be able to serve that school system, at this time. But I will let them know that there's some interest from a school system in a county, and just so they can kind of put that on their list, and see if hopefully they'll be able to do that soon or relatively soon. Private schools, at this point, we are not serving any private schools. Again, this has only been going about a year. The contract started last October, so it's been barely over a year. And of course, there was some issues with them being a little bit late and people having some issues getting into the school systems. We do intend to also serve private schools, but we just kind of have to build capacity as we move along. We will get there. We're just not quite there yet, but that's a good question. So let's see what the next slide is. So this might help answer some of your questions. So pre-ETS expansion. Currently, as I said, 70 counties are covered, which is honestly a lot more than we were with, about a year ago. We are required, this is by federal law, and this is kind of what the law states, to make pre-ETS available to students with disabilities statewide. So how are we going to go about doing that? One thing that we're doing is VR staff are setting up pre-ETS presentations in areas currently not covered. So what we've done is done what we call a couple of VR mentoring days, and we actually were in Lafayette and Tippecanoe County, and just last week we did a presentation in Richmond in Wayne County. And how those looked is that we team with local businesses. So in Lafayette it was Subaru, and in Richmond it was Primex Plastics, and if you're from those areas, you'll know that those are major employers there. We got a group of students together from the local school systems. Both of those businesses were more than willing to work with us and do tours for the students through kind of their plants and kind of talk about the work that they have available there. They also talked about workplace readiness skills, what they look for in an employee. And me as kind of the director of youth services and our VR counselors, and maybe even some of you as parents or educators, it means a lot more coming from an actual business, I think, what they're looking for in an employee and workplace readiness skills, and what they have available. We also had a couple of self-advocates come and talk about what self-advocacy means and how they can become self-advocates, as well as representatives from our local Work One office. So in this way, we were able to kind of hit a couple of these different counties and school systems and provide all 5 of those services to a fairly large group of students. Now, we're not stopping there. Obviously, we want more comprehensive programs to be available, but in the meantime, this is sort of I guess you would call it a stopgap measure. That's probably not the best term to use, to kind of help introduce students to pre-ETS and to all these different 5 required activities. We intend to do a little more of that in the new year. And we may continue to do it even as we hit kind of all 92 counties and school systems throughout the state. So that's one thing we're doing for pre-ETS expansion. The other thing is that a second request for information, or RFI, was sent out in mid-October. We did get our proposals back, and we are currently reviewing those. So we hope that through that RFI that we have it looks like we have some pretty good proposals. I'll just tell you that. We're hoping to maybe be able to hit the remaining counties that aren't yet covered by pre-ETS, at least a few of those remaining counties through the second set of proposals we received. And the final thing that we're doing is we're teaming with DWD, or Department of Workforce Development, on funding JAG through pre-ETS dollars. So JAG, if you're not familiar, is Jobs for America's Graduates. Excellent program, really helps students, not just students with disabilities, but any of what we call opportunity youth who may be having issues in school, help graduate and kind of move on to life after high school. And what they call their JAG competencies really fit kind of hand in glove with the 5 required activities through pre-eds. So we're hopeful. We're getting closer to working with DWD on funding JAG. And so that would make JAG available to more students with disabilities in some of these areas, counties and schools that aren't yet covered through pre-eds. So that's how we're looking at expanding pre-eds, because we are required to make it available and as soon as possible, basically, in areas that aren't currently covered. So my next slide is about order of selection. So let me pause here for a second, put myself on mute, have a drink of coffee, and see if you guys have any questions before we move. All right, well, I'll keep an eye out for any questions that we've got. Order of selection. So what we also call OOS, or order of selection. How this came about is, and this is federal rules, the first bullet point, a state VR agency is required to implement an order of selection, or OOS, when it lacks sufficient resources to fully serve all eligible individuals in accordance with federal timeliness requirements. So what's happened is that we have what's called in this slide federal timeliness requirements. So we only have a certain amount of time to, when we get an application, when we get a referral, to take an application on that individual. Once we take that application, we have a certain number of days to meet eligibility requirements and that kind of thing. We were not hitting all of our federal timeliness requirements. We were doing pretty good. I mean, it wasn't horrible, but it wasn't where it needed to be. So basically, because we're experiencing a deficit of resources, primarily personnel, also a little bit of funding issues, we have to enter into an order of selection, and hopefully that will help us meet our federal timeliness requirements. So what this does is it helps prioritize consumer services in accordance with the Rehabilitation Act. So we prioritize certain consumers or clients that we work with over other clients. So how do we go about doing that? Well, I'll tell you. Here we go. So what should individuals expect applying for VR services when they apply? We will continue to schedule all new referrals for an intake appointment to complete the application process. So if you have an individual who is interested in and you think would benefit from vocational rehabilitation services, by all means, call and do that referral. Go ahead and have them apply for services. OOS should not keep you from applying for VR services. Because we will take all applications, and we will also determine eligibility for every single applicant based on the federal eligibility criteria. So let me go over that real quickly if you're not familiar with it. These are the 4 bullet points under the second bullet point. This is how we determine if an individual is eligible for VR or vocational rehabilitation services. So first, they have to have a physical or mental impairment. So they have to have some type of a disability, a diagnosed disability. And this is done in sequential order. So if we answer yes to question number 1, that do they have a physical or mental impairment, then we move on to question number 2. Now, conversely, if we say no, we don't have any evidence of a physical or mental impairment, and we say no to that, we don't move on to question number 2. So let's assume that all of these are yes. The second question or item that we look at is, does it result in a substantial impediment to employment? Meaning, because of their disability or their diagnosis, is it harder for them to find a job or to keep a job? And we look at all kinds of evidence for that. So we may get medical records or psychiatric records that indicate some limitations or work restrictions that they might have. We would look at IEPs in the school system or any evaluations available through the school system to see maybe what kind of accommodations students are receiving, that kind of thing. And that helps us figure out whether or not they have a substantial impediment to employment. So assuming the answer to that is yes, then we look at the third criteria here, and that they require VR services to prepare for, secure, retain, advance, or regain employment. So there must be some type of service that we can provide that's going to help them kind of get over that hump, be able to work and to work successfully. If we answer yes to that, then the fourth one is actually presumed. Individual can benefit from VR in terms of an employment outcome. If we're able to answer yes to the top 3 criteria for eligibility for VR, we presume that yes, they're going to benefit in terms of an employment outcome. Now, There are some exceptions to that. If an individual perhaps has been through our system so many times and not been successful, or maybe if we feel like their disability is just so severe that they cannot benefit in terms of working with vocational rehabilitation, then that's on us to prove that, and we would have to do a trial work experience. That in and of itself is an entirely other webinar, so I don't really want to get into all that today. It's kind of not the point of this, but just so you know that there are some exceptions to that. So we will continue to work on eligibility for each and every applicant or individual who applies to VR. We will continue to determine the level of severity for eligible individuals. So assuming an individual is eligible for VR, then what we look at next is the severity level. And that severity level will determine their priority category, so whether or not they're actually served by vocational rehabilitation. So what we will do is we will provide all applicants with written notification of their eligibility determination. So if you're eligible, we will let you know that. And anyone who is eligible, we will let you know what category you fall into in terms of your severity level. So if this is confusing, I'm hoping that it gets a little better as I move through some of these slides. So what are the priority categories? And I'll explain these in a minute and how we come up with these priority categories. So there's 3 of them. The first is an individual with the most significant disability. So what that means is after an individual is determined to be eligible for VR services, then we look at their severity level, and if they're determined to have a most significant disability, then they're in priority category number 1. The second one is a significant disability, and third is all other individuals or maybe a disability that's considered not a significant disability. So right now, individuals in priority category 1 are prioritized first for services. So if you apply to VR, you're found to be eligible, and you're found to have a most significant disability, you will receive services from vocational rehabilitation under the order of selection. We will continue to serve all individuals who are considered to have a most significant disability. And again, I'll get into what that means here in the next couple of slides. So VR has closed priority categories, or categories 2 and 3, as of August 1st, when order of selection was implemented. So you may apply to VR services, you may be found eligible, but you may be determined to be an individual with either a significant disability or a non-significant disability. If that is the case, then you are put in a deferred list and you will not receive VR services at this time. So that's what that means. Any questions about that at this point? I know it can be a little bit confusing. And I'll talk about how we determine MSD, SD, and all that here in a second. Okay, so let's look at this. So how do we determine if someone is MSD? They must have a physical or mental impairment that results in 3 or more functional limitations, and whose VR or vocational rehabilitation can be expected to require an extended period of time. So if you have 3 or more what we call functional limitations, and it's going to take a while, 6 months or more in general, for you to have a successful closure or have a successful job through voc rehab, then you're considered to be MSD. What the functional limitations are, and I'll just read them here. What we look at are communication, interpersonal skills, self-care, self-direction, work skills, work tolerance, and mobility. So we would look at all of those areas for each individual, and we would determine whether or not they hit 3 or more of those. So if an individual has some limitations maybe in communication, interpersonal skills, and work skills, and their rehabilitation process can be expected to take 6 months or more, then they would be considered MSD, and they would be able to receive services under an order of selection. So that's what we look at for MSD. The next 2 are very similar. So for an individual to be considered to have a significant disability, they have to have a physical or mental impairment that results in 1 or more functional limitations. So basically 1 or 2 functional limitations. So of those things I mentioned, communication, interpersonal skills, self-care, self-direction, they have to hit either 1 or 2 of those, and their VR process should be expected to take 6 months or more. If that's the case, then they're considered to have a significant disability. If they wind up with 3 or more functional limitations and an extended period of time for services, then they're considered MSD. The other thing I should throw in here is that an individual who receives SSI or SSDI based on their own disability, and that's very important, is considered automatically eligible for VR services and is also considered to be at least have a significant disability. So if you have an individual who applies for VR and we can show that they have SSI or SSDI through their own disability, we presume eligibility and we presume that they have a significant disability. So what that means is that we would need to gather more information in order to determine if they're actually MSD and able to receive services at this time. So hopefully that makes sense. The third category is considered NSD, or non-significantly disabled. So they might have a physical or mental impairment, and we have proof of that, but maybe it results in no functional limitations or maybe just one functional limitation. If that's the case, and if they do not require services over an extended period of time, they're considered not significantly disabled. Now, the category of individuals that this really has affected the most are individuals who are deaf or have some type of hearing impairment. In those cases, generally, we can come up with one functional limitation, generally in communication, but they won't necessarily require services over an extended period of time. A lot of times, these individuals are needing hearing aids in order to work and work successfully, but they would be considered not significantly disabled. So that's had kind of the greatest impact on those individuals. So those are the three severity levels, and that's kind of how we determine the priority category, who is actually eligible and also able to receive services through vocational rehabilitation. Any questions about that? Either I'm doing really well in explaining this and there aren't any questions, or people have no idea where to start. So Kathy is typing. I'll give her a little chance here to ask a question. Okay, while she's typing, let's go ahead and look at this next slide. So eligible individuals in priority categories 2 and 3, so those individuals considered NSD or SD, are deferred for services as of August 1st. So that's when order of selection went into effect. So what happens with these individuals, and I'll answer your question here in a second, VR will provide information about other resources and agencies that may be able to assist these individuals in working towards their employment goals. So we have actually worked with Work One centers, Ticket to Work employment networks, independent living centers. We have worked with them. We've helped train staff at Work One centers to work with some of our clients. And not only will we provide information about these other agencies and services that might be available, we will help to make that connection and help make the phone call and do the referral for these services for individuals. So we don't want to just kind of hand them a piece of paper and say, good luck, be on your way. We want to make sure that we do everything, that's in our power to help them, connect them to those services that might be helpful to them if they are in one of those priority categories, either 2 or 3. So those categories that are eligible for services but aren't being served at this time. The other part of this is that when sufficient resources become available, individuals in priority category 2 will be prioritized based on earliest application date. So what we look at is when we take an application on an individual, we determine their eligibility and their severity level. If they go on the deferred list for services, people will come off that list based on the date of their application. So those who apply earliest will get preference over those who apply later, as resources become available and we're able to open more categories to services. So Kathy had a question. Should schools refer all students with disabilities to VR or only those deemed to have employment capabilities? That is a difficult question to answer. It depends. It's kind of the standard vocational rehabilitation answer. It depends. I don't know that I would refer all students with disabilities, but I would say that if you're in doubt, go ahead and refer them to Voc Rehab. Only those deemed to have employment capabilities. That I don't want to, I wouldn't want to make that judgment. We have worked with some individuals that may have seemed pretty significantly disabled and we were able to find employment for. And conversely, we've done, worked with individuals with significant disabilities that we weren't able to find employment for. So it would depend on the individual students' wants and needs, and kind of in consultation with their parents or guardians. How's that for an answer? I would hate to say refer everyone. I would just take it on an individual basis and determine based on that individual student's needs. So Dawn says, so only students with 3+ disabilities. No. Not 3+ disabilities, functional limitations. That there's very different things. A functional limitation is one of those items that I mentioned. I think there's 7. A functional limitation can occur in communication, interpersonal skills, self-care, self-direction, work skills, work tolerance, and mobility. Those are what we look at. So 3 or more of those functional limitations and an extended period of time makes an individual MSD according to vocational rehabilitation guidelines. So no, you only have to have one disability, but you would need to have that disability must impact 3 or more areas like mobility, communication, interpersonal skills. So please note, not 3+ disabilities. Is OHI on an IEP considered a third choice? Are these doctor approved? Is there an intake interview? So hopefully I've answered some of your other questions. I should know this, but I'm not. Oh, other health impairment. Okay. They would need to be doctor approved. So we would look at that initially, and that's a good question. If we need more like documentation, we can do our own testing. We can do medical exam, and we would pay for that through Voc Rehab dollars. So in many cases, we can look at the IEP and other documentation the school has and get the information that we need. But if we need more, we're able to look for more on our own. And yes, there's an intake interview. So everyone who applies gets an application date, and we would talk to the individual at that point. So hopefully, Dawn, that makes sense. It's not 3 or more disabilities. It's 3 or more functional limitations. Very, very different things. Okay. So what happens to individuals who are already receiving VR services as of August 1st? Those individuals will continue to receive services. So if you already had an IPE or individualized plan for employment in place when order of selection went into effect, you would still receive services. Okay, good. Glad that helped, Dawn. And I'm glad you asked, because I wouldn't want anyone thinking that you would need, 3 or more disabilities. That is definitely not the case. Any questions on any of this so far? Before I get into pre-ETS and OOS and how those two things sort of interact. Okay. So RSA guidance. RSA is the Rehab Services Administration, and they're kind of our federal arm. We have to do what they say. They make up all the rules. So this statement here is RSA guidance about how kind of OOS and pre-ETS interact. And I'll read it to you and then kind of explain it. So if a student with a disability begins one or more of the required activities, so those are those 5 activities I mentioned early on, like job exploration, counseling, work-based learning experiences, one of those 5, if they receive one or more of those activities prior to being determined eligible for VR, they may continue to receive any and all pre-employment transition services, even if they are assigned to a closed order of selection category. So if you have a student who is in pre-ETS at your school and they go and apply for vocational rehabilitation services, they're found eligible, but they're considered maybe SD or NSD, not to have a most significant disability, and that individual student is then put on a deferred waiting list, they can still continue to receive pre-ETS or pre-employment transition services. Now, here's the next part of that, and this is very important. If the student did not begin any of the pre-ETS activities prior to being assigned to a closed category, the student may not receive any individualized VR services, including individualized pre-ETS, until their turn for receipt of VR services comes up. So what that means is if let's say that same student did not receive any pre-employment transition services, maybe it wasn't available in their school, maybe they just weren't interested in that, they go ahead and apply for vocational rehabilitation. They are found eligible, but they're placed in a closed category. They're placed on the deferred wait list. If they later want to go back and receive pre-employment transition services, they are not able to because they are in a closed category. They would only be able to receive pre-ETS once their name came up from the deferred list and services were available to them. So what this means is that if you have a student that you think would benefit from pre-employment transition services, but you're also worried that they might be considered SD or NSD, it's very important that they actually receive pre-employment transition services as soon as they can. Now, that said, here's what VR is doing to help kind of alleviate this situation. So we need to ensure that if a student is placed in a deferred category, that student will still be able to receive pre-ETS. Now, it's not available statewide, and we realize that, but we're hoping that within the next year we are state, close to statewide, or if possible, we have pre-eds available statewide in every county in the state. So even if it's not yet available, it soon could be. So even if you're a student in a school or a county that doesn't have pre-eds, this is still important that you receive pre-eds prior to being placed in a deferred category. So how are we going to make sure that happens? To this end, VR intake counselors have been trained on adding new intake services for students into the pre-eds web portal as needed. So what that means is if a counselor meets a student from a local school system, what they do is they look into what we call our pre-eds web portal. This is where all our pre-employment transition services activities are listed from all of our providers working with students. If that student is in that portal already and they're in service, they're good to go. If they're not in the portal, then what happens is that the VR intake counselor adds that student's name to the case management system for pre-eds and then adds a service. Because as intake counselors, our counselors obviously are going to talk about at least one of those 5 categories. They're going to talk about job exploration counseling. They're going to talk about post-secondary workplace readiness, just as a natural part of the intake meeting. So we are naturally, as VR intake counselors, they're doing pre-eds as part of their basic job. So what they do is they look at our pre-eds case management system, or what we call the pre-eds web portal. They make sure that that student is already in there, but if they're not, they add them to the portal. So that way we can ensure that even if a student is not in a school or a county that's served by pre-eds, they get entered into the portal. They have at least one service listed. So then if the student is later put on a deferred category, they can still receive pre-eds. We wanted to ensure that that happened and that we didn't have students who would apply, found eligible, put in a deferred category, and then they can't even receive pre-employment transition services. So this is our way of kind of making an end run, I guess, around that rule. And I know that can be kind of confusing. So let me pause again and see if anybody has any questions. Okay, nobody seems to be talking. So either I'm doing great again or who knows. So I will have a couple of emails here at the end, and I think this will be made available to you later. I know the recording will be made available, but I think my slides will be made available to you also if they haven't already been. So if you do wind up with any questions after you've had time to kind of digest this and think about it, feel free to call or email me, and I'd be happy to talk to you and answer your questions. One final thing that I should kind of caveat with this is that this is all about order of selection and a student being placed in a deferred category. So we're talking about students who are actually eligible for vocational rehabilitation, but are not able to receive services because they're in a deferred category. So what about a student who, it is a lot to digest, don't believe me. So what about a student who applies for vocational rehabilitation but isn't even found eligible for voc rehab? What about those students? If a student applies for VR and they are, for whatever reason, found ineligible, maybe we cannot find a disability, or maybe they have some type of diagnosis or disability, but it doesn't result in a substantial impediment to employment, we determine that they're ineligible for VR services. In that case, they cannot receive pre-ETS or pre-employment transition services. Because remember, pre-ETS is available to students who are eligible for or potentially eligible for. Those are the 2 categories: eligible for, potentially eligible for vocational rehabilitation. So if we work with a student and we find them ineligible, then they would not fit in either of those categories. So this is sort of separate from order of selection, but I wanted to make sure that people understood that. If they're found ineligible, they cannot receive pre-ETS, even if they're already in pre-ETS or pre-employment transition services. If they go on to apply for vocational rehabilitation and they are found ineligible, they are no longer allowed to receive pre-employment transition services. So that's a little bit separate from OOS. OOS is all about a student being found eligible but then placed in a deferred category. And as long as that student has received at least one pre-ETS service, they're good to go. Ineligible students cannot receive VR services, and cannot receive pre-employment transition services. I'm sorry, I know I'm really emphasizing that, but it's caused a lot of confusion in the community, so I want to make sure that people really understood that. Any questions about that? Hopefully that makes sense. Basically, we're done here. We've questions, comments, concerns, and then the final slide has some contact information. I'll go ahead and switch to that slide if you want to take down. So obviously that's me, the Director of Youth Services on top there. Will Coltrion is a colleague of mine. He's the Coordinator of Youth Services, and he is also available for any questions or concerns. Feel free to give either of us a call, and we'd be happy to talk to you, or send us an email, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So that's all I've got today. So you'll be able to head out early for lunch, or at least during your regular lunch hour. I hope that all made sense. Again, give me a call. Let me know if you have any other questions. You're welcome, Kathy. I hope it was helpful. I'll hang around here for a little while and see if we can answer any questions. Good. Glad. I'll just give it a few more minutes just in case something comes up. You're all very welcome. I'm glad it helped. I've just had a lot of rumors flying around out there, so I was glad to be able to do this to help kind of quell some of those rumors or that misinformation that's out there. Yeah, Jill, it can be confusing, and there's kind of a lot going on in these slides. So call or email me if you need any clarification. That's all I've got. So feel free to move on to your lunch hour, whatever else you've got going on today, and I'll hang around here for another couple of minutes just in case. Well, okay, gang, I'm going to go ahead and sign off then. You guys have a great week and a good holiday season, and I'll talk to you later. Thanks a lot, everybody.